Hi, Lebbeus. Ricardo here. Can you hear us?
Can you hear the? Can you hear?
Yes, I can hear.
Only me.
Yeah. Hi, Lebbeus. We're just going to
Yeah.
just a very fast
Hi, Ricardo.
intro. How are you, Lebbeus? I mean, just to let you know that there is a kind of a massive crew here just waiting to hear talk. Brad still is here, Zaha did as well, and the other guests of the symposium, Zaya Fogel and Andrew Jones and Mario Coletti. So I think we're just going to do a very fast intro, just introducing Lebbeus Woods, one of the seminal architects of the 20th and 21st century. He's going to be talking to us live from New York, and I just have to thank Lebbeus very, very much because his first time in Skype, so was a big effort, and a thanks to his daughter to set it up as well. So thanks very much, Lebbeus.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Can you hear me okay?
I think so. Can you hear? Yeah? Cool.
Okay, just as long as you can hear. Words are important. Let me just say it's a pleasure and an honor to follow Zaha. I didn't know it was going to work out that way, but it's very good. I've written about her drawings, and I enjoyed her comments. What I want to say is very much about drawing, and very much about the reason to draw. I suppose there are those who like to draw, and they should continue drawing. On the other hand, there's those who have ideas or who are fascinated with ideas and want to somehow materialize them. And I'm one of those people who began as someone not interested in architecture, but interested in philosophy, interested in concepts, who read a lot of books when I was young, and I began to think about how to make those so-called real. And architecture seemed the ideal way to do that. So I began to study architecture and engineering as a way to build, to concretize ideas. And that's been my driving force over the years. And what has kept me interested in architecture, frankly, I don't care very much about building buildings. I care very much about building ideas. And this can be done not only in concrete and steel and glass, it can also be done with pencil and paper. And indeed, my desire from the beginning was to say, well, most of the ideas that I have will not be constructed. No one's going to pay for them to be built. Therefore, I have to build them on paper. So this is the role of drawing, to build things on paper. And Raymond Abraham, my close friend, who unfortunately died recently, always spoke about the built and the unbuilt, meaning that the unbuilt is still architecture. The drawing is as much architecture as the building. This is a very crucial point. The drawing is where the architecture is. The architecture isn't in a building. It's in the architect's manifestation of the idea, or the design of space for the concept of how people live in that space. So in the early days, and the slide you're seeing, I presume, I began to speculate on the nature of architecture in relation to the rest of the world, to nature. And I was really looking for a way to, in a sense, invent architecture from ground zero, from the beginning. Not following a style or an existing philosophy, but more or less inventing architecture as a way of thinking and as a way of being. So I was looking at ancient philosophies and even more modern philosophies, like from poet Yeats or the historian Spengler or John Battista Vico, the idea of cycles. So that nature of which human beings are a rather special part was composed of a series of cycles, and that things continuously changed, but according to a kind of order, like, day, night, midday, midnight, spring, summer, autumn, fall. There was a cycle in nature. And this is something that I believed could be understood in terms of architecture. Really what I was looking for was a way to invent architecture, not following some doctrine. So my earliest project was called the Four Cities. And this Four Cities was the city of earth, air, fire, and water. There were 4 cities. And what you're looking at is a slide of the city of earth, which was, I decided, a mining city. Now these are not necessarily ecologically friendly in today's terms. Nevertheless, the mining city was a city in which people dug into the earth. They entered the earth, and in so doing, they participated with the earth. So you can go to the next slide. This is a kind of zoom in on that former drawing. But the idea of abstract geometry, circles, cylinders, cones, cubic forms, what the human invents as a way of understanding nature. This was a city devoted to that. And the idea of mining, of digging into the earth, was a very important part of it. Next. I won't go through the 4 cities. This would be a whole time in itself, and I want to be mindful of our time frame here, because I love the period of discussion. But the idea of entering the earth, of going into the earth, and this drawing is showing that. I think what I wanted to talk about right now, this evening, is the idea of drawing. I introduced that as a way of manifesting, of concretizing ideas. So I used drawing for that, because I knew that that was the only thing I had. I could control that. I didn't need a client to give me permission to draw. I could draw. I could sit in my room, I could draw. No one would control that. So the question is one of, how do you draw? What tools do you use to draw? This is a critical question for me. And of course, my tools in those days, we're talking some years back, were pen, ink, a line on paper, building up lines, and eventually adding tones to create an image. Now, what I want to say about that is that these drawings were, in a sense, the construction. They were the realized project. They were not preparation for some building project. They were the project. So I needed to approach things in a pictorial way, to say, this is how it will look. Because I believed in the way things look is the way things are. So there is that aesthetic approach, there is that idea that the appearance of things is a kind of reality in itself. Not simply a representation of reality, it is a reality. So the drawings are the construction. So as you enter the earth, you go through certain kinds of spaces where geometry and the so-called natural formations are joined. Next. This is a view of one of the interior spaces, the City of Fire, it happens to be. It's a rather revealing image in the sense that it does point towards the rather ad hoc nature of nature on the one side, of the natural processes, meaning that things develop as they need to, not according to some ultimate plan, and also the fragmentary aspect of architecture. Architecture is made up of parts and pieces, and it's assembled. It's an assemblage. It's not a synthetic total form. It's an assemblage. Next. Talking about drawing. Maybe escaping from all the weight of the underworld and the city of Earth, I began to consider the air. What might be the domain of the lightness of the air, the light that flows through the air, the literal light from the sun and the stars, but also the fact that air is something ephemeral compared with the weight of the earth. So I had the chance to design a kind of aerial city, or at least a community. Let's not call it a city, let's call it a community, which became a project called Aerial Paris. Now, the question was, and in this drawing, you can see a kind of heavier than air object in the lower right, floating. Normally, heavier than air objects need propulsion. They need jet engines or, internal combustion engines to raise them in the air. I said, no, there's another way. The Earth is surrounded by magnetic fields, and if we use the innate magnetism of the Earth, we can levitate objects. Well, they have maglev trains that can float a few inches above a railroad track. But why not lift these houses, these buildings, into the air? And for that, I introduced the idea of these screens, these sheets of material that when dragged through the air have that pick up a static electricity that is converted to a kind of opposing magnetic force to the natural forces of the earth. So you can float heavier than air objects. This is what I proposed. Next. Now, the project was centered in Paris, and we see the Eiffel Tower in this sketch, and we see these nets or screens, these that are generating the static electricity, and we see the houses that form a part of this community floating in this vortex above the Eiffel Tower. And okay, it's a bit fantastical. Jules Verne, okay, I'll take it for that. On the other hand, it gave me the chance to look at the idea of a kind of mobile community, a kind of nomadic community. We might compare it with the Bedouins, who live in the desert, moving about. And and yet maintain a culture of nomadism. This was an aerial nomadism. It was a kind of technological nomadism. And this drawing begins to suggest that. Next. Now, of course, it was also a chance to invent forms. After all, we architects are committed to inventing the forms that contain space. And how do we do this? What do we draw on? History? That was good for thousands of years, perhaps, or at least hundreds of years. Or technology? That was modernism's approach. We let the machines dictate to us how a building should be. A house is a machine for living. But I was looking for a kind of way to invent that had to do with a different set of conditions. And the condition was nomadic, which had to do with the floating thing, but also had to do with the hybrid thing, the thing that is made up of different parts and that is not a unified necessarily, but perhaps based on fragments that come together. Next. So these scenes, and I think I want to refer back to the drawing idea, these scenes are drawn using pencil, paper, pastels, and so on, all those pre-computer materials, but which really are trying to depict scenes. So the drawings in this case are not designs that you are expected to build. Rather, they are kind of heuristic. They kind of give you an idea of what it would be like if you approach things this way, if you designed this way. So as an architect, I've never been interested in dictating a final form. I've more been interested in mobilizing a set of possibilities that others could take up. Now, I'm still waiting for some architects to take up aerial Paris in their project. Perhaps they already have. But in this case, it's about lightness, it's about mobility, it's about the transience of light. Light passes, things change. We have to stay mobile and alive. Next. For me, things changed very dramatically in the early 90s when the war in the Balkans broke out, particularly in former Yugoslavia. Prior to that time, I had been very, very much involved in more idealistic propositions, like four cities, cycles of change, and even aerial Paris and other projects. But this kind of grounded me. It brought me down to earth, literally, because here was a situation, a war in a very particular place with a very particular culture that had shocked me and brought me to the realization that we architects, who are so concerned with building and making structures and organizing space, just didn't know how to address. We didn't know how to confront war. And of course, most architects would say, well, that is out of our provenance. That is out of our domain. We can't address war. But I thought we have to address war. We have to address violence. We have to address these very intractable problems that confront our modern world, because if we're living in this world, we have to participate in it. And not only participate, maybe we need to try to formulate some answers for for others through the design of space, because space is what it's all about. That's what war is about. People want the space. They want the other person's space, or they want to secure their space. So there's war. So architects are implicated immediately. Anyway, in the early 90s, there was a series of projects that I did that had to do with war and architecture. I was much criticized by other architects who called me an ambulance chaser and a war tourist and lots of other worse things. But nevertheless, it struck me that this had to be done. So the next drawing, please. These drawings really were what I call meditations. They're not designs. They are a way of thinking about the relationship of construction and destruction. You know, if I'm going to build a new building, I've got to destroy something. I have to cut down a tree. I have to tear down an existing building. Destruction and construction, and by the way, Nietzsche, not that he's the founder of all wisdom, but he had a few good thoughts. Said construction and destruction are hand in hand. They're the flip side of the same coin. So I was trying to look at the nature of construction and destruction. How do they relate to each other? So I made a series of drawings, the next slide, which had to do with that. Now, one direction that this took me was that destruction is literally the making of fragments, the making of bits and parts. Remember I mentioned that architecture is made out of parts. Well, when you destroy, in a sense, you scatter the parts. So this particular drawing was a meditation on the condition of fragmentation, the condition of things that come apart and are scattering into a landscape, a field. And what happens to them after that, who knows? But certainly the idea of fragmentation, something I've also mentioned in relation to Zaha's work. Her earlier Peak project had very much to do with that and was very advanced, particularly at the time, in that direction. Nevertheless, the idea of the fragmentation that comes from destruction is very important. We have to face that. We have to deal with it as architects. The world is not whole. It's broken into parts. How do we put it back together? Next slide. I made a certain kind of shift, if you will, realizing that fragmentation aspect, that breaking into a field of parts that aren't joined together, in my idea of architecture. Other architects can certainly go on and do what they do and do it extremely well, and I have great respect for it. However, my interest took me into the question of the field. Zaha mentioned field, others have mentioned field, the idea of the broader landscape of the world, and the human landscape, the landscape of thought, you might say. So I entered into a series of drawings about, which I call terrain drawings. And these drawings had to do with how the fragments might reassemble or begin to reassemble into landscapes. This required a change in my drawing technique. So all of that rendering, that heavy rendering that had been done, in the previous projects I showed you, suddenly gave way to linear drawing, the use of lines. Okay, it's still rendered because when you group lines together, they form tones and they form a kind of rendered surface. Nevertheless, it was the lines that became important. Next. So from this field, forms emerge and forms melt back into the field. They emerge and they go back. This is a cyclical thing, maybe touching on my earlier idea, but the important thing is the field, not the forms. The important thing is the broad landscape of the world, not those individual things that rise up from it, like us. We can say like our individual selves, but which die, if you will, or melt back into the landscape. So it's this transformative aspect that was important to me in these drawings. The idea of transformation. How could I express that? Okay, I could have made a movie. I could have made an animation. I chose to make a drawing. And the idea, this is a kind of critical point, that the drawing, even though it is a still life, it's a moment, hopefully invokes a past and invokes a future. So this is the participatory level is on the level of imagination. So one can see it alive, and the drawing has to do that. If it doesn't do that, then it doesn't work. Next. Of course, I use another technique, not a drawing technique, the idea of photomontage. But it's still a graphic technique. It is like drawing. The idea of the photomontage, where you photograph, in this case, a model, and you recombine it. And this I did with razor blade and Scotch tape. I wasn't at the computer stage yet, but it had to do with that synthetic quality of the recombinant, the recombining of pieces into a total landscape. So it remains a kind of drawing technique. Next. Yes, okay. So my interest had shifted from the idea of the building of the solitary object into the field condition, into that broad landscape out of which things emerge and back into which things melt in a continuous cycle. So much of my time in the past couple of years has been spent making drawings which have to do with that field condition, that kind of turbulent and changing field condition. And for this, of course, those rendering techniques, the idea of the color, rendering, the texture, the sense of surface, and all of that are gone. And this was probably a major turning point in my work, which has had several manifestations, which I won't go into because of our time limit. But nevertheless, I would have to say it's probably a lot less approachable than the earlier work, which attempted to visualize a result. This is perhaps more attempting to visualize a process. Next. So the field conditions, in a certain sense, have a uniformity, but they have, the crucial part is that they have differences. And I think the challenge for the future in our design fields generally, but certainly in architecture, is to articulate, to be able to perceive and articulate the differences in similarities. So that a field like this, which has a certain uniformity, nevertheless does allow for some articulation of parts and pieces, even though they're integral with the total field. Next. It should be another slide. Okay. this has moved back towards architecture and the idea of a building. This is from my 100 Towers project. But now the building is no longer a definite form. It has a profile, but it's shifting. I was interested deeply in the idea of pentimenti, the idea of approximation, where lines form approximate boundaries and not necessarily fixed boundaries. This is not a building you want to build, but maybe it's a building that is in formation in the mind, nevertheless physical. Next. So this is also from the 100 Towers series. 100 towers, 1,000 towers, 1 million towers. God knows how many the Earth can sustain. Nevertheless, the idea of the energy contained in the vectors defining boundaries is very much a part of this. This is the last image, and all I want to say in conclusion is that drawing in the various forms you've seen, which I think are certainly have changed over the years, has provided me with a chance to express ideas, to concretize the ideas that have interested me, particularly the idea of transformation. Thank you very much.
You can just put it down. We're breaking ground here, so let's wait a little bit. Sorry, Lebbeus, we just organized everything here. Zaha, please join us, please. Yeah, everyone is. You okay? I mean, okay, Lebbeus, Zaha is just behind you on the screen. Okay, we'll go ahead and hopefully she can join us soon. Just to carry on a bit pretty fast because there's a feedback. Just a question about approximation that started by Mario Coletti. We're gonna have to wait. Marian, I think it was very interesting what you said, approximation and not precision. And I think this conversation passed throughout the whole afternoon. Approaching drawings and approaching the process of creation, the process of rendering this speculation, not only as a precise method, a precise sort of machination of the process. So maybe you could just talk a little bit more about that and what you perceive also through the afternoon, so we can open a conversation maybe.
Okay. Well, I mentioned approximation in relationship to rigor somehow. Yeah. I mean, I'm an architect, so within the discipline, obviously, again, the word itself assumes that there's a certain protocol that is enacted by us in order to create something and also to be capable of recreating it. I think that, and that's therefore, I think with this aspect of the duplicability of a process, I think approximation is an essential and inevitable aspect of precision that we can achieve. Also, I mentioned the fact that as an architect, I'm very interested in the response of the drawings or the projects, prototypes, or whatever spaces that I create. And in order to be capable of predict or to speculate about how users or people are going to understand it, I think I have to speculate about that, and I can only be approximative. I think if I demand full control over how people really are going to use the space, I think that becomes too fascistic, and that's something I'm not really interested in. And the approximation also to do, though, with rigor, which means that it's not necessarily, I mean, skills themselves are not going to do the full job. I think that serendipity or how could you put it into words? Sometimes it's the wish to illustrate a concept, although that's partly a game in itself, and the ways of translation. That's also something that came across during the talks, how these visions of first emotional response to the drawing then can be translated into something which is far more strategic and conveys more information about space, scale, and all actually the codes that architecture needs for itself to be comprehensible to others. But somehow I think the game that I wanted to play is approximation and rigor as well, so that I don't know if that's maybe something that in your practice, I mean, after this I really feel like the architects as being like the poor cousin of of your discipline, where actually there's a lot more manpower and structure and logistics in place to achieve something that we can only dream of. And I just want to spread this conversation that actually your best results are actually when they become almost invisible. And if there's approximation of invisibility there as well, that's something that I might ask to, if I can.
Carry on, right? Yeah, I mean, there's definitely quite a lot of approximation that goes on in visual effects in general, and definitely, like you said, I mean, it's an interesting industry because there is actually quite a lot of resources in visual effects. There's quite a lot of money to be made in Hollywood, and that gives you both a lot of freedom to try new things creatively, but it also kind of can tend to tie you down to a very particular vision that is had by a Hollywood executive or a producer or a director. You hope that it's someone who's a director that has vision, but sometimes it can often be the person has the purse strings. And there's definitely quite a lot of exacting work that needs to be done to make sure that you get things as perfect as you can. But like I said before, a lot of the stuff that we do is actually cheats. It will look right in 2 dimensions on a screen, but in 3 dimensions or in that sort of way, it is absolutely an approximation, and that's something that we do quite a lot. Yeah. Do you want to talk about approximation?
I guess approximation, that's one of the advantages of being a fine artist, is that I'm kind of an army of one, and I'm the judge, jury, and jailer when it comes to executing most of my ideas. So there are some times where some of the visions do entail the work of other people, and I think just to kind of echo what Lebbeus says, it's, for me, my work, it's really all about the result, and as long as I can make the process of a painting the result in itself, then I find myself that I'm really satisfied with it.
And Lebbeus, I think also in your presentation there is, you started kicking off as saying that this is more about the ideas than rather the constructed. Can you hear me? And just, I think it would be interesting because the table is talking about approximations.
Can you hear me?
Yes, carry on, please.
Okay, let me just say.
that's a rather interesting point. Exactly because seeing Zaha's presentation, it was very impressive to see how this approximation is led to rigor in this plethora of built projects that her office has actually put out in the last year. So, Zaha, do you have a comment about this approximation, how this has led to rigor? Okay. No? Okay, I'll carry on here. Andrew, going back, I think it'll be interesting because we took it to a tour yesterday evening through the facilities, and I thought it was quite interesting your perception of the space and the perception of what the students are up to in terms of construct versus expression, like how experimentation and expression can come together as you said, almost like a personal output of your feelings into a maquette, into a build, extract, into a drawing. And I think that led quite nicely, seeing your presentation today, into how you actually construct your presentation and your work based on a very simple idea of on a representation of a reality, and from that you change it, right? Just going slightly on a tangent on what we spoke now about approximation, and seeing how you've been kind of transiting now between both universe. Could you speak a bit about it? Specifically about how your experimentation, and this transition now that you do. I wouldn't say that I wouldn't force like into the construct, but actually trying to get the approximation of a feeling, approximation of an expression, right, which is something much more difficult to say. As Bergman said on his film Scenes from a Marriage, we in the school we learn about mathematics, we learn about agriculture in Africa, we learn about how to build buildings, but we know very little about what makes us tick. And I think your work has a lot about that, and also Lebbeus' talk has a lot about that. So how do you actually create this maybe approximation between the feeling that you have and your performance and the drawing itself? How much is out there which is abstract, random, versus just actually the true expression of a feeling and the validity of that for you? Make sense, maybe?
Yeah, I guess I can talk about where it comes from. Might be the easiest way to say it. In the work that I do, especially in the performance realm, what I found is that when I can quiet myself down, that there is a current of conscious creativity that exists around us at all times, and in a lot of the work that I do and the service that I can be, it's about getting to the point of quieting myself enough that I can recognize when the current is, and then when the current comes, to be able to get out of the way and let it come through me, to let it channel, is the closest I can come to that approximation. And I think we were talking before, it's really I'm fascinated by seeing a lot of the work here, to see not only do the students have the opportunity to put their intentions into a work, and I think it's what really interests me about architecture, but they're able to express themselves and serve a form and a function simultaneously. And I think it's just amazing that's the opportunity that's afforded to you. Whereas with me, a lot of times it's just the ability to express that intention.
Anyone has a question in the audience? I'm sure you guys have. No questions? Yep.
I do. Andrew,
Yeah.
Oh, Lebbeus has a question.
I do have a question, Andrew.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question for Andrew, and I immensely enjoyed your presentation.
So do I feel that my art needs to relate back to a social absolutely. I feel that there's oftentimes that I find that whenever I'm making art that doesn't relate to that, it just feels like I'm engaging in idle fancy, because I believe that right now that the possibilities that are afforded to us as artists, the ability that we have to communicate and be socially responsible with the work is imperative. And if there isn't, if I'm not investing myself into a project that in some way can empower someone or inspire them or help to change their thoughts, or isn't doing something, then I feel that that I'm squandering the time and the privilege that I have of being someone that has the ability to create. I mean, just the concept of human creativity. I see human creativity as like the sparkling interdimensional jewel of human consciousness, that we are afforded that what such a pleasure, that it is an honor and a huge responsibility.
Thank you. That's a beautiful answer.
Thank you, Lebbeus.
Right. I think there was a question in the audience. Do you still remember? I think, do you need a microphone? No microphone, so just a live question. Okay, just fire up.
Okay, so the question had to do with the way that we constructed St. Peter's for the film Angels and Demons, and actually, because like I mentioned when I was saying, we didn't actually have all of the geometric data that we would have had if we were able to go physically to the Vatican. We did actually try to use basically any other type of information we could get. Most of it ended up being, like I said, from taking high-res digital shots in the Vatican posed as tourists, and a lot of it came from satellite imagery, because currently you can get quite a lot of detail from that satellite imagery. And you know, I'm actually not sure if we ended up going back to the original detailed drawings of the basilica. I'm pretty sure that information would have been also difficult to pry from the hands of the Pope. But what we ended up doing in the end was really just ignoring the set that they built in Los Angeles and going back to the original dimensions of the actual St. Peter's Square.
Certainly, I can be a bit more specific. When it comes to this shamanic experience, one that I feel comfortable sharing would be the work that I've done with a particular vine called ayahuasca. I don't know, maybe a small show of hands if people are familiar with ayahuasca, or if they've heard of it before. It's also called the vine of the soul. And I've been working with that particular medicine in an ayahuasquero for 4 years now. And I recently had the opportunity to actually go into the Amazon jungle and do an 11-day dieta, where you do nothing but you fast and you pray and you consult with this vine. You drink this ancient vine, and I guess it's interesting how that would relate to architecture and visions. It's sometimes I feel uncomfortable speaking of it. It's kind of the to even give it words is like to throw the pearls at the swines. But I can share that there are within these realms, I have seen vistas and what I mean, I guess you could almost use the word architecture or environments that I'm confident are beyond anything that my imagination is capable, meaning that it's not a there's a difference between visionary plants and hallucinations. Hallucinations are usually figments of the mind. With the visionary plants, I have seen architecture that is so undescribable that to try to recapitulate it into a drawing would be blasphemy, if that maybe can shed some light on the amount of inspiration that those events give me. And there's complicated things like that, and there's also very simple things too, where a lot of the messages that I've been given in that shamanic experience, when it gives you a certain dialogue with another entity that there's a back and forth, and a lot of the times you can consult it for guidance in your life. And one of the simplest and most profound pieces of advice or information that is given to me from the plant or from the vine is to be creative. That is one of the greatest gifts that we have, and one of the biggest opportunities we have, and one of the reasons that we're here.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Thanks very much, actually, everyone, for the conference, the symposium. We're going to wrap it up now. Thanks, Lebbeus, also for being with us and waking up early in New York and to be part of the symposium. Just a reminder that at 6 o'clock, means in 25 minutes, there will be an opening just at the gallery on the other side, the Books of OMA by Rem Koolhaas, and this will start in 25 minutes. So if you hang around a bit more, you will catch the exhibition. So I maybe just a few words just to end. I just would like to thank all the speakers, the crew, director Brad Steele, Crystal CG for being so optimistic and generous with us, and all the AA stuff, which has been amazingly tolerating and really generous. So thanks very much for everyone, and hope we can do a number 2 soon. Thank you.